The coffee was still warm when they found Harold Mitchell's pickup. Steam evaporated from the thermos on the dashboard, its metal side glinting in the faint October sunlight that came through the windshield. The engine was still idling, keys hanging from the ignition switch, the driver's door wide open as if Harold had just stepped out for a glance around in the cornfield. But Harold Mitchell was nowhere to be found. It was 9 on the morning of October 15th, 1992, when neighbor Tom Bradley spotted the truck from his own property line. Something about the scene didn't seem right to him immediately. Harold wasn't careless. He wasn't the kind of man who would leave his truck idling or waste gas. In over 3 decades of farming, alongside one another in Grain County, Kansas, Tom had never seen Harold waste so much as a drop of gasoline. There was something about that vision which gave him a chill that was unrelated to the cool, full air. The truck was stopped about 50 yards into Harold's cornfield, parked between 2 rows, as if he had pulled over to check his crop. The brown corn stalks towered above, their dry leaves whispering secrets in the wind. Harold's work gloves were on the passenger seat, and on the dashboard his thermos of black coffee, still steaming, just the way Martha had fixed it for him every morning for 28 years. Tom yelled Harold's name, and it rang out through the clearing. The only response was the wind and a distant lowing of cattle. He walked slowly around the truck, looking for footprints, but the dry ground gave up nothing. Finally, he got up the courage to walk in closer. On the seat of the truck was Harold's wallet, bills visible through the cracked leather. His reading glasses were folded beside it. The radio was on low, a Conway Twitty song fading in and out of static. It all pointed to a man who had simply meant to walk away for a little while, not disappear forever. By the time Sheriff Robert Clark arrived, word of the strange scene had already begun to spread through the small town of Millerville. The sheriff, a stout man more used to rounding up stray cattle than missing persons, took careful notes and snapped Polaroid photos of the truck. The odometer indicated that Harold had driven exactly to 0.3 miles that morning, the distance from his farmhouse to this spot in the field. Tom Bradley explained to him that he'd been fixing fence posts and noticed the truck, and that the time wasn't right. Harold pointedly started work much earlier. He pointed to the still steaming coffee, the missing cap that usually hung from the mirror, and the eerie quiet of it all. The sheriff began to comb the area, every few steps calling out Harold's name. The corn stood over 6 feet tall, creating dense golden corridors that swallowed sound. There were no tire tracks, no signs of struggle, no clues at all. Just an idling pickup, and a mystery that was colder by the second. As afternoon shadows stretched across the field, Sheriff Clark knew that this was no ordinary case. Harold Mitchell, as predictable as the Kansas seasons, had vanished into thin air. Harold was the kind of man small towns get built around. Stable, reliable, and firmly rooted in the Millerville way of life. He was 54. With the weathered look of a man who'd spent his life in the open air, his hands hardened by work, his face lined by decades of sun. His routines were as predictable as sunrise, morning chores at dawn, coffee in the kitchen, the same cafe each Tuesday, the same church pew each Sunday. His wife, Martha, had been his rock for 28 years. A schoolteacher who was renowned for her kindness and her prize-winning apple pie. She and Harold had raised 2 children, Michael, an engineer in Topeka, and Sarah, a teacher in Kansas City. Together, they represented all that was wholesome and steadfast about small-town American life. That morning started out like any other. Martha kissed Harold goodbye at 6:15 a.m. standing in the kitchen window, and watching as he got into his truck and drove off toward the backfield. She waved, he waved back, the same simple ritual they had performed for years. She was expecting him home for lunch, as usual. But when noon came, and went without a call from Harold, a flicker of worrying inched its way into her chest. By 1 o'clock, the flicker had become a knot of fear. Harold was never late. She called Tom Bradley, asking if he had stopped by to review the irrigation project they'd been laboring over. But the moment Tom answered, she knew something was amiss. There was a seriousness in his voice that made her heart plummet. The farmhouse that Harold's grandfather built in 1923 had always been warm and full of life. But as Martha sat at the kitchen table waiting for news, every sound, every creak of the floor, every tick of the clock, echoed through the silence left by the man who had never once not come home. The coffee pot was full enough for 2 cups, just the way Martha had made it every morning for years. Harold's reading glasses still rested on the kitchen table, beside yesterday's newspaper, which was open to the commodity prices page. As word of his disappearance spread through Millerville's close social network, friends and neighbors began appearing at the Mitchell farm. Dorothy Coleman from the post office brought casseroles. Jim Peters from the grain elevator offered to help with evening chores. The kitchen soon filled with worried voices and the muted, uncertain sound that always seems to accompany tragedy. They all speculated, but none of their speculations proved out. Harold did not drink, except for a rare beer at a church gathering. He did not gamble. He did not owe money to anyone, and he had no enemies that anyone was aware of. His last medical checkup had found him in great health for a man his age. The farm was prospering, the mortgage nearly paid off, and his marriage to Martha was steady and affectionate. Their children called often and visited regularly. There was simply no logical reason for Harold to have abandoned the life he had built. Sheriff Robert Clark arrived at the farmhouse near sundown, his expression serious as he explained what they had, and hadn't, found. He asked Martha about Harold's state of mind, whether he'd been depressed, or whether anything unusual had happened during the last couple of days. With every inquiry, she became more confused. Harold had been Harold that morning, brooding, focused, talking about getting the corn in before the weather turned. Nothing at all had been out of kilter. As the evening fell on Millerville, Martha spent her first night alone in 28 years of marriage. The home, that had housed 3 generations of Mitchells, now felt huge and vacant, every room echoing with questions she couldn't answer. Outside the soft yellow glow of the porch light Harold had installed at spring, the Kansas fields stretched out into the evening, holding on to a secret no one yet suspected. The idyllic, simple life that Harold and Martha had built together was now broken by something unimaginable, and all that remained was silence and the suffering of not knowing whether Harold was in danger, hurt, or worse. The morning of October 16, 1992, was grey and cold over Millerville. It was the beginning of what was to be the biggest search in Greene County's history. Sheriff Clark had not slept, having stayed on the phone through the night with the Kansas Bureau of Investigation, trying to make sense of how a man could simply vanish in the midst of his own land. By 7 that morning, volunteers were gathering at the Mitchell farm. They fogged the chill air with their breathing as they milled around folding tables covered with thermos pitchers, donuts, and crudely hand-drawn maps. The Greene County Sheriff's Department consisted of Clark and only 2 deputies, nowhere near enough to handle a case of this magnitude. But the people of Millerville, all 847 of them, mobilized with muted determination. Farmers postponed harvest schedules. Shop owners closed early. Teachers arranged for substitutes, so that they might join in the search. Even high school students came after school, their young faces serious as they received instructions. Clark divided all the individuals into search parties and assigned a section of Harold's 640-acre farm to each party. The land stretched from Highway 34 in the north to Willow Creek in the south, wide fields of wheat and corn, open range dotted with cattle, and a woodlot where Harold had cut firewood every winter. From a distance, it looked like simple farmland. Up close, it was a maze of places where a man could fall, hide, or be hidden. Around noon, 2 bloodhounds arrived from Topeka, German shepherds Rex and Duke, led by Sergeant Maria Gonzalez, who had worked dozens of missing persons cases. She placed the dogs on Harold's truck, letting them sniff the driver's seat, the steering wheel, and his work gloves. Rex immediately hit a scent and started moving through the cornfield, nose to the ground, tail stiff with focus. The trail wound its way through the rows and made a beeline for Willow Creek, a small, meandering stream that had cut its way through the Kansas prairie for centuries. The water was shallow but persistent, its banks lined with cottonwoods and thick brush. At the water's edge, both dogs lost the scent. They circled along the muddy bank, sniffing frantically before sitting back on their haunches, a clear signal that the trail had gone cold. Sergeant Gonzalez waded into the creek, probing the water with a long metal probe. It was barely waist deep, running clear over a sandy bottom. There was no trace of Harold. No clothing, no footprints, nothing to suggest he had ever entered the water. The trail simply ended at the water's edge, as if Harold Mitchell had walked up to the creek and disappeared into thin air. When the light failed on that first full day of searching, all of the volunteers gathered again at the farmhouse to report their results. Tom Bradley's crew had covered the east fields and found nothing but Harold's cattle grazing in their pasture. The high school youths had combed the woodlot, searching under each fallen tree of enough size to hide someone. Dorothy Coleman's team had walked the entire fence line, looking for any sign of struggle or disturbance. Both teams returned with the same news: nothing. Sheriff Clark was sitting on the porch as the last of the searchers returned home, their flashlight beams crisscrossing the dark fields like fireflies in the distance. It was now 48 hours since Harold Mitchell was last seen, and the search had yielded nothing. No clues, no witnesses, no motive. Harold had disappeared, as completely as if the earth itself had swallowed him. The bloodhounds had given detectives their single physical lead. Harold Mitchell had covered the ground from his truck to Willow Creek on his own 2 feet. But even that single discovery was one which only served to deepen the mystery. Martha Mitchell was seated at her kitchen table in the farmhouse, surrounded by the remnants of communal solidarity. Empty casserole dishes, crumpled paper cups, and scraps of paper covered with the telephone numbers of volunteers who had promised to keep looking. The house itself now felt odd, filled with the presence of other people and the absence of the one person she loved most. Out in the yard, Harold's truck was quietly sitting where the tow truck had left it, looking ordinary and harmless, as though it were not keeping the secrets that had ruined her life. The details began to arrive piecemeal, as if unfolding like images in the soft red light of a darkroom. With every new tip, it seemed as if another dimension was added to the enigma that had swallowed Millerville. 3 days after Harold's disappearance, Sheriff Robert Clark embarked upon the tedious process of reconstructing October 15, 1992, minute by minute, in a bid to discover any deviation from Harold's routine that would help explain what had happened. Martha helped him piece together the morning. Harold had awakened at 5:30, just as he had every morning for 30 years. He'd eaten black coffee and toast with strawberry jam, the same homemade jam they'd put up together last June. He'd mentioned something about having to check the moisture content in the back 40 before he could decide whether they ought to start the harvest the following week. There was nothing out of the ordinary in his mood or in anything he'd said. He'd kissed her goodbye at 6 and headed off to what should have been an ordinary day. But the investigation was soon to discover cracks in that veneer of normalcy. The first was in Harold's telephone records, which disclosed a late-night call, 9:23 p.m., on October 14th, the night of the day he vanished. The call had been placed from a payphone at a truck stop 30 miles west on Interstate 70, and had lasted for 14 minutes. Martha remembered the call clearly. Harold had picked it up in his study and closed the door, something he never did. He usually took calls at the kitchen table, while she did lesson plans in earshot. When Clark pressed her for details, she admitted that Harold had been changed after that, more subdued, distracted. That night when they were sitting together, watching the 10 o'clock news, He'd gone to bed without saying much. When she'd asked him if everything was okay, he'd merely said it was probably nothing. Those two words now haunted her. Tom Bradley added one additional detail, his second interview. That morning, when he'd first spotted Harold's truck, the cattle had been in the wrong pasture. It was a minor detail, but deeply out of character for Harold, who followed an inflexible rotation schedule that had been passed down from his father. To find the herd in the south pasture, when they were supposed to be in the west, was like finding his truck driving backward. It didn't add up. That lead caused Clark to go interview Pete Morrison, Harold's southern neighbor. Pete's land bordered Willow Creek, and he could see Harold's backfields clearly from his bedroom window. Pete recalled seeing headlights on Harold's property around 2 in the morning on October 15th, hours before Harold's daily routine began. One had thought it was Harold working with an animal, but now the timing became significant. More rumors began to spread as Clark conducted his interviews. Sally Weber, the post office clerk, remembered Harold being distracted when he'd come in to collect his mail a few days before his disappearance. He usually would talk about the weather or crop prices, but that day he'd said nothing and rushed out. At the grain elevator, Jim Peters recalled Harold asking strange questions about land values and crop insurance, the kinds of things a man in good financial standing wouldn't be apt to worrying about. Then came the most troubling revelation, from Harold's daughter Sarah, in a telephone call from Kansas City. Crying, she told Clark that her father had called her 3 days prior to his disappearance. He'd asked a series of odd questions about her brother Michael's work schedule, whether he was traveling for his job in Topeka, when he would be home, and whether he'd mentioned having any trouble recently. It struck her as weird. Normally, Harold would have asked Michael himself. Sheriff Clark began putting these pieces together in a time frame. The truck stop call, the cows in the wrong pasture, the 2A.M. headlights, Harold's sudden questions regarding children, and his interest in life insurance policies. Alone, each piece of information was harmless. Together, they described the picture of a man who was grappling with something heavy, something that had disturbed the steady rhythm of his life. The missing persons case was no longer just that. It was now deeper, darker, and far more complex. Harold Mitchell did not simply disappear. He had been harboring a secret, one that had quietly changed him in the days prior to October 15th. The question that haunted Sheriff Clark was simple yet terrifying. Was something being planned by Harold? Or was someone planning something for him? Clark's workspace stacked with interview records, photographs, and evidence bags, each pointing in conflicting directions. The truth, it appeared, lay somewhere in between what people remembered and what they would prefer not to recall. Time itself froze at the Mitchell farmhouse. Martha could not find the energy to move Harold's reading glasses from next to the kitchen table. The house was quiet, poised between hope and grief, waiting for answers that never came. Martha couldn't bring herself to wash the coffee cup Harold had used on his final morning. She couldn't accept that the man who had shared her bed for 28 years would never return to explain what had really happened in those cornfields. The home, once alive with the soft rhythm of everyday existence, was now resonant with the hollow sound of her footsteps and the tick-tock of the grandfather clock Harold's father had built in 1947. Their son Michael traveled from Topeka, and his engineer's mind automatically searched for reason in a situation that defied all logic. He walked the ground with a surveyor's eye for detail, pacing off distances from the truck to the creek, calculating how far his father could have traveled in the short interval between his leaving the house and the discovery of the abandoned truck. The figures offered comfort for a while, a structure to hold on to when everything else appeared to be random. But soon, the calculations yielded only questions, and no solutions that math could provide. Their daughter, Sarah, drove from Kansas City every weekend, determined to help in any way she could. She used her teacher's attention to detail to make timelines, organize Sheriff Clark's scattered reports, and call missing persons organizations in 3 states. Her dedication was inspiring and heartbreaking, the kind of relentless hope that only someone who refuses to give up can muster. They all fought the sorrow in their own way. Michael installed motion-sensitive lights around the farmhouse and put in a new security system, telling his boss he needed more time with family. Sarah started a reward fund, coaxed a Kansas City newspaper into keeping Harold's story alive, and fought tirelessly so no one would forget. Martha's mourning was less visible, but no less devastating. She went on setting 2 plates at the dinner table 4 months, not remembering until after the food had cooled that one would not be used. She changed Harold's pillowcase weekly, as though expecting him to come through the door at any moment. Finally, the tension started to tell. Martha's grade school granted her a leave of absence after colleagues noticed how preoccupied she'd become, staring out the window towards the distant cornfields that now represented both hope and horror. The town's initial outpouring of sympathy slowly ebbed as the months went by. By winter, the casseroles stopped appearing on her porch, the phone calls slowed, and the volunteers slowly went back to their own lives. Millerville was a small town, and small towns don't have a lot of entrance for tragedy. Life has to go on, crops must be harvested, bills paid, children fed. And so, Harold's disappearance fell into a quiet ache that folks didn't talk about much anymore. It was a reminder that terrible things can happen to good people for no reason at all. By the 1-year anniversary of that October morning, Martha had lost nearly 30 pounds and had developed a tremor in her hands that even made grading papers difficult. Michael's marriage began to fracture under the pressure of his obsession with the case. Sarah took a leave of absence from teaching altogether, spending every waking moment looking for her father. She told her friends it was the only thing she could do that felt like anything. The worst moments came when harvest time rolled around. The drone of distant combines, slicing through neighboring fields, would send Martha into quiet, uncontrollable sobbing. Harold ought to have been there, overseeing the work as he had done for 30 years every summer. Instead, she was leasing the land to Tom Bradley, unable to bear the thought of traversing the same fields where her husband had disappeared. The Mitchells were hostages of October 15, 1992, stuck in a vortex of unanswerable questions and unbearable possibilities. They existed in a purgatory where mourning was impossible because death had not been confirmed as a reality. Yet hope was cruel because each passing day made Harold's safe return more improbable. The farm that had sustained 3 generations was now a monument to uncertainty, its fields and fences irreparably marred by the mystery that had taken Harold. 6 months after the disappearance, on April 15, 1993, Sheriff Robert Clark's case was officially moved to cold case status. There was no ceremony, no ritual, just the quiet act of moving Harold's file from the active drawer on Clark's desk to a grey metal cabinet in the basement of the courthouse. The manila folder, bursting with reports, photos, and evidence logs, found its spot alongside dozens of other cold cases, each one a story of loss waiting for an ending. Theories about Harold's fate began proliferating like wild prairie grass after spring rains. Each seemed reasonable at first, but none could survive the facts. The most logical explanation, the one the townspeople preferred, was that it was a horrific accident. Maybe Harold had suffered a heart attack or stroke while checking the crops, tumbled into Willow Creek, and been carried off by the October floodwaters. Search teams pulled the creek 4 miles downstream and recovered old equipment, rusty tools, and even the remnants of a deer skeleton. Nothing human. The Topeka Medical Examiner remarked that bodies in flowing water do not tend to stay hidden very long. They surface within weeks, drawn upward by decomposition gases. But weeks turned into months, and then a year. The creek had given up nothing. Harold Mitchell was still unaccounted for. By October, the Kansas air had turned crisp, and the days were cool enough to make working the fields bearable. But as the weeks passed, and there was no news of Harold, even the most hopeful neighbors began to lose heart. 2 months of ceaseless searching later, the accident theory, once the town's comfort blanket, started to fray. There was no indication, investigators determined, that Harold had fallen, drowned, or merely walked away by mistake. But the idea lingered in the minds of many in Millerville, who would rather have an accidental tragedy than the more sinister possibilities. No one wanted to speak. When Sheriff Clark examined motives of a financial nature, the picture didn't fit that tableau either. Michael Mitchell permitted investigators full access to his father's bank accounts, which painted a picture of modest stability. Harold still carried a small balance on his farm mortgage, $23,000, well within the means of a man who'd worked the same land all his life. His checking account showed the regular rhythm of deposits from grain sales and cattle auctions. There were no out-of-the-ordinary withdrawals, no hidden accounts, no insurance policy changes that indicated desperation or deceit. Having ruled out fiscal and accidental explanations, the Kansas Bureau of Investigation provided a third, one that gave Martha Mitchell the chills. What if Harold simply left? They pointed to the mysterious payphone call the night before his disappearance, and his sudden interest in his children's schedules, as signs of systematic planning. Maybe, they theorized, Harold had decided to start fresh somewhere else. The suggestion tore Martha apart. She replayed every moment of those last few weeks, every taciturn look and direct sentence, trying to remember if she'd missed a hint, some suggestion that Harold had been hiding something from her. Sheriff Clark chased the theory hard, checking bus station tape, interviewing truck stop employees, and talking to police departments in dozens of states. Nothing materialized. Harold had not been seen at any station, rest stop, or roadside cafe. The only lead was still that pickup truck, silent on the edge of his cornfield. There was no development, and attention shifted to the possibility of foul play. Clark began investigating past disputes, talking to neighbors and farmers Harold had clashed with. There had been some small boundary disputes over the years, the kinds that happen when fences get fuzzy and tempers get short, but nothing serious enough to lead to violence. All of the people Clark spoke with had an alibi for that October morning. As years turned into months, the speculations grew more outlandish, dark, and desperate. Some said that Harold had stumbled upon something he wasn't meant to, perhaps criminality hidden in the peaceful fields, and was killed to protect someone's secret. There were murmurs of mistaken identity, or a secret life beyond Millerville that none of them could ever have imagined. And then there were the wildest stories, rumors that Harold had been recruited by federal agents, drawn into some undercover sting that had backfired. The government, of course, would not confirm or deny any of it. By the time Sheriff Clark retired in 1998, the truth seemed farther away than ever. He took Harold's case file home as an unofficial personal mission, a puzzle he couldn't stop trying to solve. Years passed. His replacement, Sheriff David Brennan, was left with the cold case, but had nothing much to pursue. The Mitchell family persisted on their own, paying private investigators, visiting psychics, and tracking down every rumor that came their way. Every lead ended the same way, nowhere. Harold Mitchell had disappeared, as if the earth itself had opened its mouth and swallowed him whole, leaving behind nothing but questions that swelled with each passing year. Then, in the winter of 2018, hope returned to Greene County in the form of a new sheriff, Amanda Rodriguez. At 38, she was armed with 15 years' experience in Kansas City's cold case unit and a master's degree in forensic science. She was analytical, dogged, and not afraid of ghosts that lingered around old cases. Rodriguez devoted her first week on the job to descending into the courthouse basement, a dismal archive filled with decades of past tragedies, reduced to forgotten memories, and began sorting through each of the cold cases dating back to 1960. When she reached the thick file named Mitchell, Harold, disappearance, 1992, something about it caught her attention. Not its age, but the unanswered questions contained therein. By 1992 standards, Clark had been thorough. But Rodriguez saw what time and technology had changed. The anonymous payphone call from that truck stop could now be reinvestigated with today's tracing systems and enhanced audio analysis. The bloodhound trail that had grown cold at Willow Creek could be retraced with ground-penetrating radar and cadaver dogs that could sniff out remains long buried. When Rodriguez proposed reopening the case, the county commissioners balked. Why dig up old wounds, they asked, when most of the town had long since resigned itself to the reality that Harold was never returning. But the sheriff stood firm. Justice wasn't subject to a deadline, she said. A new technology might finally provide closure to a woman who'd waited 26 long years for answers. Martha Mitchell was 79 by now, her mind keen, but her body weakened. She resided in Millerville's unpretentious nursing home in quiet anonymity, her window facing the same horizon she and Harold would look out upon at dawn. The knowledge that someone still cared enough to look, after all these years, stirred something in her that she hadn't felt in decades. Hope. The first real breakthrough came not from the fields, but from the photographs, old Polaroids, that had sat untouched in a dusty evidence box for more than 2 decades. Sheriff Rodriguez sent them to the FBI's forensic lab in Quantico, where digital enhancement uncovered details invisible to 1990s technology. What looked like an innocent set of tire tracks next to Harold's abandoned truck yesterday now had something unexpected. A second tread pattern, a second vehicle, and for the first time, there was concrete evidence pointing to the fact Harold hadn't been in the cornfield by himself. More surprising were the subtle soil disruptions trapped in those same photos, gentle ripples in the earth that human eyes had gone unnoticed in the process. With renewed determination, Rodriguez commissioned a research group from Kansas State University to conduct ground-penetrating radar surveys across the ancient Mitchell farm. The technology, once employed for archaeological dig sites, could now map the hidden topography of the ground, layers of history, disturbance, and rot. Under grey-March skies, the radar team leaned slowly across the landscape, their screens flashing with reports from decades of life beneath the ground. Most of what they uncovered turned out to be routine stuff: rusty fence posts, abandoned equipment, and geological curiosities of Kansas soil. But 3 were different. They were unlike the others, symmetrical, controlled, and unmod by decades of cultivation. They were all in the woodlot deep down, where Harold would chop firewood in the winter seasons. That was all Rodriguez required. He asked the Kansas Bureau of Investigation and brought in cadaver dogs, Atlas and Ranger, to German shepherds, who were famous for their incredible accuracy, had helped crack dozens of cold cases from years past across the Midwest. Their handler, Detective Sarah Chen, explained how decades after death, traces of human decomposition can be seen in soil, especially in Kansas Creek's clay-based soil. When the dogs reached the woodlot, they transformed totally. They courted around it, whined, and began scratching with a focused intensity that was unmistakable. Human remains were buried there. Rodriguez marked the spots with orange flags and instructed excavation to begin. She recognized this would be the moment that might lastly close the questions which had tormented the Mitchell family and the whole community for more than 25 years. It swept like a fire through Millerville. People had waited so long, they barely thought it was true. 56-year-old Michael Mitchell, executor of his mother's will, came over from Topeka to have the digging himself. His sister Sarah, a schoolteacher and mother now, took time off work to come too. For the first time in decades, the quiet town that had kept the secret of Harold Mitchell hidden in silence was stirred once again, filled with curiosity, fear, and an old, painful hope. Sheriff Rodriguez understood what was at stake. This was more than just an investigation. It was facing the past. The excavation began at dawn on April 3, 2018. against a thick clouded horizon. Each move was deliberate and slow. The Kansas Bureau of Investigation's forensic anthropology team, led by Dr. Marcus Webb, dug in layers with careful archaeological precision. There was no margin for mistake. The first site revealed the remains of an old farm dog, likely buried years ago by Harold himself before he disappeared. The second yielded nothing more than broken machinery and dishes, relics of an earlier time that had ploughed this same land. But the third site, deep along beside Willow Creek, under a stand of cottonwoods, held something quite different. A bit over 18 inches into the ground, Dr. Webb discovered the first clues that Harold Mitchell's death was not an accident, or a self-inflicted disappearance. Blue denim bits protruded from the earth, preserved by the cold, oxygen-poor clay, the same hue and fabric as the Wrangler jeans Harold was wearing on that October morning in 1992, a birthday gift from Martha only months earlier when he vanished. The team worked in quiet, photographing every item before they took it out, and the bones, broken, weathered, but unmistakably human, Dr. Webb's preliminary analysis indicated the presence of signs typical of deliberated mutilation. Whoever had killed Harold hadn't acted in desperation. They plotted, they'd waited. They'd wanted his body never to be discovered. Michael stood on the periphery of the crowd, white-faced and grim, as strangers uncovered the truth his family had prayed for and against. When his sister arrived in the late afternoon, she collapsed into his arms, as the reality of what they were seeing finally began to dawn. The hope that they had clung to for 26 years vanished in an instant. Then came more evidence, information, that made the story even darker. A metal detector sweep picked up Harold's wedding ring, hidden a few feet outside of the area. Next to it was his watch and wallet, personal belongings any robber would have grabbed with them all left on the body. Their deliberate separation suggested something very personal. Someone close to Harold, someone who needed to kill him, but not quite erase. And finally, detectives discovered nylon rope fibers on Harold's wrists and ankles. The material, also discovered at the farm, had been cut instead of torn. Dr. Webb's experts determined that Harold was bound, gagged prior to his death, and when they finally unearthed what appeared to be his skull, buried beneath the others, the evidence was conclusive. Multiple fractures, characteristic of multiple hits with a blunt instrument. Perhaps something to this time, perhaps something more substantial, something easily found on any farm. It wasn't killing. It was intentional. It was premeditated. With word spreading this time throughout Millerville, shock yielded to something sharper. Fury. The fact that Harold's killer had walked among all these years, attending church, offering condolences, even helping to look for the man he'd buried. It was a worse betrayal than the deed itself. Sheriff Rodriguez and the district attorney's office began to build a case, reassembling what time had tried to erase. It was a task of enormous proportions. 26 years had passed. Witnesses had passed away, relocated, or let their recollections fade under the weight of speculation. But now science had something stronger than recollection: DNA. For the first time since 1992, the truth was within reach. The long-awaited breakthrough had finally come, but it wasn't the kind the Mitchell family had prayed for. Instead of closure, it brought devastation. The evidence was now undeniable. Harold Mitchell hadn't vanished by choice, nor had he met with an accident. He had been murdered, deliberately, brutally, and his remains hidden for over 25 years. Someone in Greene County had seen the Mitchell family's tragedy year after year, aware all along of what was truly transpiring. For Sheriff Rodriguez, the question now burned hotter than ever: was there sufficient evidence remaining that might still watch a killer be brought to justice after all these years? That answer arrived on a steamy Tuesday morning in June of 2018, hidden within a plain manila envelope that would redefine all that the Mitchells thought they were familiar with. Within were the DNA results from the Kansas Bureau of Investigation, The case's forensic geneticist, Dr. Jennifer Walsh, had managed to extract DNA from Harold's preserved bone marrow and match it against national databases. Confirmation of Harold's identity was no surprise. The surprise came from the second DNA profile, one found on the rope fibers used to tie Harold's wrists. That sample did have a match in the system. Rodriguez stared at the name on the report over and over, transfixed. Thomas Bradley, age 74. Harold's closest neighbor, and the man who'd called him reporting Harold's missing truck 26 years earlier. Tom Bradley, the leader of the search parties, comforted Harold's widow and stood with the family through each tragedy. Tom Bradley, who had leased Harold's property after he went missing, attended his memorial service and cried at the altar. Rodriguez pulled his original case file out from 1992 and read through the original interview transcripts. Tom had testified to seeing Harold's truck at 9 o'clock one morning while repairing fence posts, but re-scrutinizing cellular tower records revealed no calls from his land until 10 a.m., nearly half an hour past when he had reported. It had been an innocent mistake at the time. Now, it seemed to be a lie. The greater the evidence Rodriguez found, the clearer the story grew, and the more ominous. Soil analysis revealed that the grave in which Harold was found had been dug weeks prior to his death, back in the dry September, when the clay would have been easier to penetrate. Tom Bradley's property bordered that very cemetery, with a fence he himself had built years earlier, in the name of cattle control. Then the coup de grace. DNA from skin cells found under Harold's fingernails was matched with Tom Bradley's DNA profile. Harold had fought for his life. The forensic pathologist determined he'd struggled desperately, clawing at his killer hard enough to embed his murderer's DNA under his nails for all eternity. Harold's rope had been severed, not torn, the tool used. A pair of pruning shears, discovered in Tom Bradley's barn, whose blades carried microscopic metal shavings, the same as the cuts in the rope strands. As the investigators dug deeper, the motive at last came to light. Financial reports indicated that in 1992, Tom Bradley was in hock, 3 loans in arrears, a foreclosure hanging over him, and no way out. Harold, on the other hand, had land sitting atop a recently discovered natural gas deposit. Information Tom had learned from a cousin who worked for the survey company. The telephone call in the middle of the night that had summoned Harold out on the morning he died was from Tom. He'd gone out to a truck stop to place the call so it wouldn't be traceable from his home line. At 9:23 p.m., he'd said to Harold a tale of cattle breaking through their common fence line, and knowing how Harold felt a sense of responsibility, hoping he'd respond and show up at sunrise. Sheriff Rodriguez reconstructed the crime in gruesome detail. That morning, Tom had ambushed Harold in the cornfield and beat him repeatedly with a tire iron. He then murdered him and dragged him to the pre-dug grave, burying him beneath growing quantities of clay. And then, to complete the deception, he left Harold's truck in the field, left the engine running and the coffee still hot, painting the perfect scene of an immediate vanishing. Even the misplaced animals were all in on the act, moved intentionally to support his deception. But most chillingly, it was not the science that produced the worst shock. On the spot, during the first investigation, Tom Bradley hadn't just complied, he'd stage-managed. He'd taken search parties away from the grave, instructing them to search downstream from Willow Creek, when he knew the reverse direction was where the truth lay. He was willing to work with the neighbor counties, ensuring he would be in a position to manage information and decide what others found out. He had lived among them for 26 years, shaping their grief, guiding their hope, and keeping his secret safe. When the truth was revealed to Michael and Sarah Mitchell, they remained in stunned silence before District Attorney Rebecca Chen and Sheriff Rodriguez. Every word was a slap in the face. Their father's friend, the person whom they had affectionately referred to as Uncle Tom as children, had killed him. Sarah ran to the courthouse bathroom and vomited, her body revolting from something that her mind could not. The betrayal hurt them more than what was done. Tom Bradley had attended each family gathering, assisted in mending fences, eaten with them, even held Martha Mitchell's hand in church. She prayed for direction. He had stood in their home, looked them in the eye, and provided comfort, all while aware of how Harold had been killed. The people of Millerville were shocked. The one whom they trusted, respected, even admired, was revealed to be a monster hiding behind a neighbor's smile. That pillar of small-town trustingness, once indestructible, was broken in a single night. All the good deeds that Tom had done were questioned, all the gestures of largesse doubted. And then, finally, came vengeance. At dawn on June 28, 2018, 26 years, 8 months, and 13 days after Harold Mitchell was killed, Sheriff Rodriguez arrested Tom Bradley. Deputies and KBI agents surrounded Tom Bradley's farmhouse as he began doing morning chores. He was feeding cattle in his barn, the same cattle he had utilized as bait to lure Harold to his killing, when Rodriguez arrived. He ran? No, he didn't. He bellowed and wrestled, raving and cursing, but he didn't beg. His puffy face bore no expression of surprise, no apology, merely exhausted resignation, as handcuffs closed across his wrists. The man who had played the role of grieving neighbor for nearly 3 decades simply nodded when told that he was under arrest for first-degree murder, conspiracy, and desecration of a corpse. His only request was to call his daughter in California, a call that would shatter another family's illusion of the man they thought they knew. As his booking photograph was released, Millerville fell silent. The man who had once organized church dinners, who had shoveled snow for the widows and mended fences for the old people, now sneered at the camera with empty eyes that provided no hint of regret, no flash of human compassion. The mask had finally slipped, and beneath it was the face of a predator who had been among them the entire time. The mugshot of Thomas Bradley became the face that defined him, cold, hollow-eyed, and unrecognizable. It replaced decades of beaming snapshots that once had him standing beside Harold Mitchell at county fairs, harvest festivals, and church picnics. That one image erased a whole lifetime of spurious virtue. The news of his arrest spread faster than the morning wind in Greene County. Everyone had heard by morning. It reached every household before newspapers even arrived at doorsteps. The diner at Millerville was packed with townspeople, their gossip riddled with shock and betrayal. Others nodded their heads in stunned silence. Others cursed with shaking anger, recalling things that now filled them with gall. The search parties that Tom had mounted, the assurances he'd made to Martha, the land he'd bought from Harold for what now seemed an eerily low figure. Each generosity now looked like part of his cover. The judicial process began hesitantly, each step gravitated. District Attorney Rebecca Chen knew that with overwhelming forensic proof, this was a case that needed finesse. One wrong move would wipe out 26 years of patience. The proof was convincing, but Chen was facing a jury who grew up with the defendants, individuals who'd shared Sunday dinners and tractor repair with him. Convincing them that a man they trusted for so long was guilty of premeditated murder required more than science. It called for truth spoken with compassion, not vengeance. Tom Bradley's court-appointed public defender, who was assigned after he claimed indigence, had a battle on his hands. The DNA evidence was unassailable. His client's history, his being at every critical juncture of the initial inquiry, revealed not innocence, but a telltale awareness of guilt. With exoneration impossible, the defense shifted tactics, seeking mercy based on Tom's advanced age and poor health. Mercy, however, had been pillaged from the Mitchell family for decades. Followed another heartbreak. On August 15, 2018, 3 weeks before the trial, Martha Mitchell passed away peacefully in her sleep. She was 80 years old. Her children believed she had waited long enough to discover the truth, but her spirit could not withstand seeing the man who had destroyed her life put on trial. Martha was buried beside the empty grave that had been prepared for Harold in 1992. finally to headstones side by side, reunited after all those losses and tears. The trial began on September 10th in the old Graham County Courthouse, the same building where Harold's case file had sat gathering dust for more than 2 decades. Judge Patricia Morrison presided, as reporters filled every seat and cameras lined the hallways. The small-town courtroom overflowed with faces, some seeking justice, others struggling to reconcile the friend they knew with the killer they now saw. By every session, Tom Bradley did not budge. There was no flicker in his face as expert witnesses described the savage facts of Harold's murder and the 26-year deception that followed. Dr. Webb detailed the forensic evidence with gruesome detail, describing how fragments of bone told the story of savagery and cover-up. DNA experts testified, indisputably, that the genetic trail went straight to Tom Bradley. Sheriff Amanda Rodriguez testified next, leading the jury through the timeline that had ultimately brought Harold home. She spoke in measured but mournful tones, especially when recounting finding Harold's remains mere yards from the murder scene's property line. The courtroom was silent, a silence heavier than words. After 4 hours of deliberation, the jury returned. Guilty on all counts: first-degree murder, conspiracy, and desecration of a corpse. Tom Bradley, 75 years old, was sentenced to life in prison without parole. The same earth that had so long concealed Harold now echoed with justice. Tom, for the first time, broke. Tears streamed down his face as the reality of his lifetime of deception at last toppled about him. Outside the courthouse, Michael and Sarah Mitchell stood in front of the television cameras and the assembled crowds. They made their statements quietly, firm but with tears. They said that justice at last had come, but far, far too late. No verdict could restore the lost years. No sentence could erase their father's absence or their mother's grief. They called on the world to celebrate Harold, not in the way he died, but in the way he lived. A man who loved the good in humanity, who believed in people next door, who loved his family with all his heart and soul. 26 years to the day that he disappeared, Harold Mitchell was laid to rest on October 15, 2018. The funeral that had been out of the question in 1992 was at last a moment of peace and closure. Hundreds gathered to honor him, their grief infused with hard-won closure. His headstone's inscription was simple words: a life separated by 54 years, that was born and expired in deceit, but would endure in its decency. And as the crowd broke up beneath the quiet Kansas sky, one truth remained: evil does not always come with a stranger's face. Sometimes, it smiles from over the fence line. If Harold Mitchell's story has stirred you, if it's made you look at your own neighborhood and ask what's lurking just beneath the surface, or subscribe to our channel. We tell true tales of justice delayed, but not denied. Leave your thoughts below. What do you think the town missed? What would you do if someone you had trusted for years turned out to be a killer? Because stories like Harold's remind us of a single omnipotent truth: justice can slumber, but never perish.